It's all about sweater modifications in this month's Knit and Chat. We're going to talk about all the different ways you can customize a hand knit sweater, and we'll rate them from the easiest to the most difficult. So grab a drink and you're knitting, and let's settle in for a good chat. Hey nerdy knitter, Tanya here. I'm a certified knitting instructor and a master hand knitter, and the goal here at Nerdy Knitting is to help you become a more confident, adventurous knitter. And learning to customize a hand knit sweater is definitely one of those top tier things that confident knitters should be able to do for their sweaters. So you should be able to take a pattern and your own body measurements and customize that pattern to fit you very well, because let's face it, unless you're going to fit the averages in those patterns, you're going to have to make some modifications somewhere. A lot of people do. I would say most people have to, unless you're just like the normal average shape B cup and you just fit, all the sweaters look great on you, then good, this video is not for you. But for the rest of us, we have to make modifications. It's just the facts of life. Like, somewhere in our body we don't fit those averages and we have to make adjustments. But the first step in this process is actually choosing the right size first. And I discussed that in last month's Knit and Chat. So if you haven't watched that, I'm going to link it down below, so you can go watch that after you watch this one, of course, and I'll put it on the end of this video maybe too, so you can click through and watch that one if you've missed it, because you need to pick your base size first, and we really go deep into that topic in last month's Knit and Chat. Once you've chosen that size is when you can start making all of those customizations that you need to really make the sweater fit well. But just as a quick recap in a few sentences, as the fewest sentences possible, when you're looking for a base size, patterns are based on your full bust. Like, it'll say, your bust should measure this, and then like whatever amount of ease is included in that. But those sizes are all based on the average that you are a B cup, which it means that you are about 2 inches different from your upper bust, which is like right under your your underarm, when you measure around there, compared to your full bust. So if you're a B cup, or about 2 inches of difference between your full bust and that upper bust measurement, then sweater patterns will probably fit you just fine. If you're outside of that norm, say you have a larger bust, then sometimes you probably end up knitting sweaters that are just too big through the shoulders because you chose a size based on that full bust. Or you have the opposite problem, is you have a smaller bust but your shoulders are broader. You choose a size based on your full bust and it's too tight in your shoulders. So in those instances, you don't want to choose a size in your pattern based on your full bust. Unless, like, you can get away with it if you're probably a C cup even, but anything larger, then you're going to want to choose a size based on that upper bust measurement and then make modifications, because then you'll get a sweater that's going to fit you well through your shoulders, which is where we really want our sweaters to fit. We don't want them falling off, and then we can customize everything else. It's much harder to customize the fit through the shoulders, so that's why you pick a size based on that first. So the last video really dives into that topic, so we're not going to completely rehash that here, but I'll link to that one so you can watch that, because it's important to know which size to pick first. And then once you've chosen that pattern size, that's when you can get into the things we'll discuss today, actually making all of those different modifications. Now, today we're just going to go over the basics of these modifications. I'm not going to sit down and go through all of the math and show you how to work everything out. I'm just going to give you more of a broad overview of how it works, and then direct you to some resources so you can work these things out on your own. But I am going to be doing a workshop. I got a purl and I have to pay attention when I purl. I have to look at my knitting. Okay, I'm on the knitting, so now I can just knit and talk to you. So anyway, so today is just going to be a broad overview of those topics, or those types of modifications that you can make. But if you want to go into more depth, I am going to be doing a workshop. I'm going to open it in December, and we are going to take 2 months, January and February, to work through a top-down raglan sweater. And the goal is you can choose any sweater pattern that you want, and I will walk you through how I'm going to modify mine. I just ordered the yarn for mine. I'm going to probably be using the Flax by Tin Can Knits, and I was thinking of pre-recording everything, but I think I'm actually going to do it live. Like, in our first week, I'm going to show you like the modifications I will make right at the beginning, choosing my size, my base size, and then neckline modifications, adding short rows, things like that. And then we're going to work through the sweater. Basically, I'll show you how I make those changes to the sweater and how you can apply that to your sweater. So basically, you should be able to take any top-down raglan, just a basic top-down raglan sweater, and add modifications to it. So that is going to be open in December. So I'll put a link to the waiting list down below. It's just a little simple email form. You can join that waiting list, and when it's open in December, then I will let you know that you can like join the workshop, and then there'll be like an introductory video about choosing your yarn and your pattern and all of that kind of stuff. So I'll have a link for that down below. Now, the last thing before we get into everything is resources, because we just have time to just do sort of a high-level overview instead of like sitting down and really going through the math for each of these things. I wanted to tell you about some different books and resources that I would recommend. Now, first of all, I would recommend Amy Herzog. All of her books are fabulous and they have so much good information, but I think when it comes to modifications, my favorite one is probably Knit to Flatter, because she talks about that a lot in that book. She has a good section on like just which types of sweater shapes and elements you should look for based on your body shape, but then she's got a great section on modifications and changing like sleeve length or adding bust darts and all of those things. So Amy Herzog's Knit to Flatter, and I'll have links for all of this down below. And also her Ultimate Sweater book. It has like base patterns, if you think of like the Ann Budd books with the charts and all of the different yarn weights and all of that. Amy Herzog's Ultimate Sweater book is sort of like, I think, an updated sort of version of that. It's got like the classic, all of the classic constructions in a pullover sweater and in a cardigan, like base patterns with nothing going on, and then a lot of other patterns where she shows you how she makes modifications to create different designs based on those base patterns. So you have the base patterns, and then you have all her information about, you know, adjusting necklines and sleeve lengths and all of that. I feel like those sections are a little bit light compared to like the modifications in Knit to Flatter, but they're still both really good books. I have them both. I like them both. So I would recommend those. And then I would add Sweater Knitting in Plain English by Maggie Righetti. Now this one is very chatty. Like it's more of a like sit and read. Like she's just very chatty in this book. But this one goes deep into just starting from scratch with different sweater constructions and working out the math for yourself. So, but definitely she makes it very user friendly. Like it's chatty, but it's very easy to follow. There's a lot of math involved, but she breaks it down step by step. So that one is good if you want to just skip having like a base pattern and jump right into like knitting a sweater from scratch with your gauge and her instructions. So that is a really good one. Another one I really like is 6,000 Pullover Possibilities by Melissa Leapman. Now this one I like for, I've never actually knit a sweater from it, but this one takes the different like sweater constructions. They're all knit flat in pieces, but you've got like your set-in sleeve and your drop shoulder, raglan, like all of those sort of how the sleeve fits into the body of the sweater. That's what I mean when I talk about construction. So these are all knit in pieces and sewn together, but it's really good for seeing what necklines look like, or the different base necklines and how you can add, like take a crew neck, turn it into a turtleneck, things like that. Like there's lots of, those details are really well like laid out in this book. So if you really want to get a closer look at like if you want to make like a lot of adjustments to necklines and stuff, I really like this book for that. And just overall like sweater design as well. Like it is also charted out with all of these different sizes and gauge. I'm not sure about gauges. I think so. But then yeah, it's like you can knit a base sweater and then make all of these modifications. Choose your neckline, choose your sleeve length, and all of that stuff. So I'll link to all of these down below, but I highly recommend them if you want to really jump into customizing and perhaps even like knitting a sweater from scratch and adding your own customizations to it. Now, 2 more book recommendations would be Custom Knits and Custom Knits 2 by Wendy Bernard. Now this one is also like a pattern book with lots of patterns in it, but she's got really good information on making different modifications, adjusting like your necklines, adding bust darts, the basic ways like that top-down raglans or yoke sweaters, things like that, how they're knit, how to do like short row sleeve shaping, like if you've knit like the body of a sweater, how to add sleeves with short rows. Just lots of good information like that in those books. Like there's certain things in Custom Knits 1 and then other things in Custom Knits 2. They're out of print, but you can usually find like used copies fairly cheaply online. Now we're going to break down these modifications. I think I have 6 here that you can make from easiest to most difficult. So we have 2 that fall into the like the easiest to do category, and then 2 that are sort of intermediate, 2 that are more difficult. Now I will say, if you want to start making modifications, especially the ones that fall into the intermediate and more difficult, then you're going to want to choose a sweater pattern that's pretty simple, like in stockinette stitch, because it's harder to make modifications if you've got to deal with stitch patterns as well. Because let's say you're working short row bust darts, if you've got like a stitch pattern that's all over the whole front of the sweater, you've got to take that into consideration when you're working short rows and how that's going to change, and that makes things much more difficult. So if that's not something you want to tackle, then start with just a plain stockinette sweater for these modifications. Let's get into the modifications now. So the first easiest thing to do is to add length to your sleeves or the body of your sweater. Now, if the sweater body is like there's no waist shaping, nothing going on between the underarm and the hem, super easy to add or shorten, to add length to it or to shorten it based on what you need. That's easy to do. Same with the sleeves. And if a body does have like some sort of a shaping in there, generally patterns will have sections where you're sort of working straight. Usually you've got your cuff before you start working the increases for the sleeve if you're working, so you're working your sleeves from the bottom up. And then after the increases are done, there's usually another inch or so where you're just working straight before you do any other changes. And same with the body, a lot of the times you're working straight at the hem and then you might start increasing or decreasing. And then there might be another section if there's like waist shaping, you're working straight for another inch or two before doing increasing or decreasing to the bust. And then another area of working straight right there. So those are the places if there is shaping. So on the sleeves, there's going to be shaping most likely. And on the body of the sweater, if there's shaping. So if there are, like, look through the pattern and look for those places where it says to like work straight, work even. And that's where you can add those lengths to your sweater or shorten them if you needed to. So that's the easiest way to do this. The next way is a little bit more difficult, and it will require a little math, but it's not like super difficult to do. Like you just have to sit down with a pen and a paper and a calculator and then just get a quiet space. And once you've done this a few times, it gets much easier. So let's say there is shaping involved and you don't have enough space in those work even places to shorten or lengthen things, and you've got to change like the rate of shaping in the body of the garment itself or in the sleeve. Like a drastic example would be like, say it's a full length sleeve and you want a 3/4 length sleeve. That's 2 very different sleeves. You're going to have to rework that. There's no just working fewer rows in those work straight sections. You're taking off quite a few inches of knitting. We'll use that as our example. So what you need to know is like the stitch count you're starting at and the stitch count you're getting to. That's the first thing. So let's say you are knitting your sleeve top down and you know what the stitch count is around the bicep. And then you've decided where you want that sleeve to end. And you're going to have to decide about the stitch count you need in that area. If instead of your wrist, it's going to end up here, you need more stitches left to get around that forearm than you do around your wrist. So you should know your measurements, know like the circumference of that area on your body that you want that garment to end at. And then you are going to maybe add a bit of ease unless you want like super skin tight sleeves. And let's say you're adding 1/2 inch of ease at that point. So you take your 1 inch stitch gauge and you multiply it by that number, and that tells you your ballpark figure for stitches. And then you can sort of like round it up or down based on stitch patterns. Like if your cuff is going to be knit 1, purl 1, rib, then you're going to need a multiple of 2. if it's worked in the round. If it's worked flat, you're going to need an extra 2 stitches to seam it up. Or if it's a knit 2, purl 2, you'll need a multiple of 4, something like that. So you've got to figure that out. So you know your starting stitches, where that bicep is, and you know your ending stitch count, where you're going to stop knitting, and the stitch count you need to get to. So you're going to subtract that smaller number from that larger number, and that will tell you how many stitches you are removing from that area. And the reverse is also true. If you're starting down there and working your way up, then it's the reverse. How many stitches you have to add to get to that point. So we know how many stitches we have to add. And then we have to figure out how many rounds it's going to take. So I'm going to use our sleeve example. We're knitting from here down to the forearm. We want like a 3/4 inch or 3/4 length sleeve instead of like a full to our wrist sleeve. So we've got to decide on our ending stitch count because we can't use the same stitch count. We've figured that out. We know that now. So now we have to know the length. So you've measured your arm. You know how long that sleeve has to be. So convert that to rows or rounds, obviously. So you have your stitch gauge in your 1-inch stitch gauge, and you multiply that by that length of that sleeve that you need from your underarm to that point on your body. And that tells you how many rounds you have. So from there, I know there's a lot to this, but it's not hard once you sit down and figure out. Everything really comes down to your stitch and row gauge and your stitches and your rows. So you have the number of rows that you need to get from point A to point B, basically. So you're going to want to, first of all, subtract like whatever your length for your cuff is going to be. So take out that many rows. If you know you want a 2-inch cuff, then remove 2 inches from that list of the number of rounds that you want to work. And then I like to take out like 1 inch or so at each end just to work straight. And then if we've messed up somewhere, we have a little bit of leeway that we can play with there. And then that gives us the full number of rounds that we have. And we know how many decreases we have to make. So now that we can put the rounds aside, we know how many rounds we have to work our shaping. Now we have to figure out how many rounds we have to actually work our shaping. So we know our stitches, the starting stitches, our ending stitches, and the number of decreases we're making. So in the example of our sleeve, we know that we're probably going to decrease 2 stitches on every decrease round, because usually you knit 1, you do a decrease, you knit to the end of your round and do another decrease. So you've got 2 decreases along that decrease line on your sleeve. So, I mean, that might be different for a sweater. You might have 4 decreases on a sweater. So you're going to take the decrease number, or the number of decreases you have to make, and divide it in half, basically, because you're going to work 2 on that sleeve round, or you divide it into 4, or divide it by 4 if you're doing like 4 decreases on your body. So it depends, like how many stitches you started with and how many you have to remove or whatever. So you might have to round up or down because you obviously need a number that's divisible by 2, or if you're taking out 4 stitches, you need a number that's divisible by 4. But we'll go back to the case of our sleeve. So we have our stitch count, we've divided it by 2, and rounding it up or down that stitch count so it can be divisible by 2. And that tells us how many decrease rounds we have to work. So now we know our stitch counts for the starting and the ending place. We know how many rounds we have, and now we know how many decrease rounds we have to work. So now how are we going to fit those decrease rounds into that sleeve? We're not going to just start decreasing every single round and then stopping and knitting straight. We want to sort of evenly distribute them. Now the easiest way to do that is to divide the full number of rounds that you have in that shaping area, divide that by the number of decrease rounds that you actually have to do. And that, I mean, it might be like every 3 rounds, every 4 rounds, every 2 rounds. Hopefully it works out to be easy enough to figure out. So now let's say you've got to decrease those 2 stitches every 2 rounds, and you start out doing that, like you do your first one, you work your plain round in between, then you work another decrease round down to about where you need to stop, and then do your plain knitting, and then you start your cuff. Sometimes it's more difficult to work that out, like it doesn't seem to work out. In that case, there are other math formulas you can do. I don't want to get into the deep part of that, but there are a lot of online calculators. If you look for online shaping knitting calculator, they'll pop up and you can plug your numbers into there and it will spit it out for you, like how your shaping rate, basically. Like if you're decreasing, like in our sleeve example, it will tell you. So like every 4 rounds 5 times, and then every other round 2 times, or something like that. So there are online calculators that you can use to figure this out. So I know that was a lot. It's not as difficult as it sounds like talking about it like this. You just need to know your gauge, your stitch gauge and your row gauge by the inch. And you need to know, so you need to know your starting stitch gauge, where you're starting, like our sleeve, where you're ending, the stitch gauge there, subtract the 2 so you know how many stitches you're removing in this case, since we are decreasing, and then divide that by the number of decreases that you're working. So we are working 2 decreases in a round, so I'm going to take that number, round it if I have to get to an even number, and then I can divide it by 2, and that tells me how many rounds I have to decrease. And then I have to work out my sleeve length, measuring from that underarm or whatever to that point on my body where I'm going to end, and then convert that by multiplying it by my 1-inch row gauge or round gauge. That tells me how many rounds I have, removing a little bit at the beginning and end for working even and working the cuff, and then divide those rounds by the number of rounds we actually have to work our decreases on. And that will tell us how often to work our decreases. I hope that makes sense. I am going to have this all written out. Like, I have my notes right beside me, so you can refer to them again if you want. If you're on Patreon, you can even just join like the free, there's a free 7-day trial. I'm going to like save my script as like a PDF file, and you can go download that and work through this yourself as well. But that's the basics of it right there. But if that feels too difficult to figure out those decrease rates or increase rates, just look for an online knitting shaping calculator and it'll like spit out those numbers for you, as long as you know how many rounds you're working and things like that. So that works for both lengthening and shortening. Like if you're changing the length of something on the sweater itself and you're adding shaping somewhere, like if you're adding waist shaping or something like that, the same thing applies there. You need to know the stitch gauge of where you're starting from, where you're ending from, or the number of stitches in those 2 places, so you know how many stitches you're removing or adding, and then the number of rounds you have in between to work that shaping. So you would use this whenever you are drastically changing the length of, say, the sleeve, like you're going from a long sleeve to a short sleeve or a 3/4 sleeve. That would work for all of those situations. It also works for the body. If you want to add waist shaping, if you want to change the shaping, say it's straight, you want to make it A-line, or you want to make it cropped and sort of like an inverted shape where it's like sort of sucks in at the waist, and then you have to add some increases for your bust. This method works for all of those places like that where you're changing the length and also adding some shaping in some way. And along with like the script where I'm going to have this all written out, you can also refer to those resources I mentioned. I know Custom Knits and Knit to Flatter both have good information on things like this. Now, Easiest Part B takes this same calculations, and like we used in our sleeve example, you would add this for waist shaping, but in this specific instant, I'm talking about like vertical darts. In a lot of patterns, the shaping is done along like the sides, where you're either increasing or decreasing to get some sort of shape along the sides, whether you're making an A-line shape or you are doing some waist shaping where your hips are larger, you are reducing a bit for the waist and then coming back out again for the bust, that kind of shaping. But instead of working it at the sides, I like to use vertical darts. Like think of like a button-up blouse that has like those princess seams in the front where the top is more fitted. You can do the same thing with your knitting. And I first came across this in some Amy Herzog resources, and I'm going to link to an article on her website that goes into more detail about this. But basically, instead of placing those decreases or increases at the sides, we move them so that you get that, you can see the lines a little bit better, but the point of it is to remove the fabric or to add the fabric where it actually needs to be added, where our shape is changing. Because a lot of us, we might be more up and down along the waist, but we have more change in our shape on the front and the back. Like for example, I need to add some extra space to the front for my bust and my stomach, but I don't need all of that extra fabric in the back. But I do want some along the bottom part to curve around my bum. So I like to use these vertical bust darts along the back to remove that fabric on the back of the sweater. I don't need all that extra fabric there, because if I cast on a sweater to fit my full bust, all of that fabric isn't actually on my full bust. Half of it's on my back, and I don't need all that extra fabric on my back. So those vertical darts can be used in the front or on the back. So I'm going to link to her website. It walks you through like where to place them. Basically, on the back, you want to place them, you want to divide your stitches into thirds. And you have a marker in between dividing those, and that's where you'd work your increase or your decrease lines along those markers. Instead of along your side seams, you just move them into the back of the sweater body. On the front, it's more about you put half the stitches in the center and then a quarter of the stitches on each side. So your markers are like over here. And that's the line where you would work your increases and decreases between your bust and the hemline. So say you're going to work like from the hem to the waist, you're decreasing some stitches, and then you get to the waist and you work a little bit straight, and then you start increasing for the bust. Now, this is also a great way to add darts for bust shaping. If you have to add a little bit, like say just an inch or two, then vertical bust darts like this are fabulous. You don't have to get into the short row bust darts where you're working short rows back and forth across the bust area. You can add these darts when you are knitting your sweater, and then just you're adding the shaping right where you need it. Instead of at the sides, it's like shaped right in the front, like that button-up shirt that has those princess seams. So if you're working from the bottom up, it's very simple to do. You have those markers and you are decreasing to your waist if you want to, and then you're increasing from your waist to your bust to give you enough extra space in your bust. And then after your bust, you can simply remove those stitches. Instead of like doing it along those, you don't want vertical dart lines right here. You can take them out like around the sleeve edging instead. Well, like just follow your normal pattern for whatever size you're knitting, but then whatever extra stitches you added for the bust, just remove them along that shoulder line shaping as you're going as well. And then you can get back down to your stitch count that you need for your shoulders. So it's very easy to do that kind of shaping as well. But basically, instead of working it at the sides, you're moving it where you need it to be, like along the front lines or along the back lines. But I'll link to Amy's website to the article where she goes into more detail on how to do this. Okay, so those are the easy things to change, and I know right now they might not feel very easy, but once you sit down and you've done this a time or two, it gets pretty simple. Like it's not that hard. It does get more difficult when you've got to think about the stitch pattern. That's why I think start with this plain stockinette sweater where you don't have to think about the stitch pattern. But even that is not impossible. But definitely something that you should give a try, and it's the easiest thing to do, shortening and lengthening the body and the sleeves. So next we're going to move into our sort of intermediate things that are sort of a step up from that and require a little bit more forethought. So the first thing is changing the neckline. So first of all would be changing like the shape of the neckline itself. Like say it's a crew neck and you want to change it to a V-neck. That's what I'm going to be doing with my flack sweater. I don't really like crew neck sweaters. Well, as long as they come down. I like them if they come down a little bit lower, but not right up around my neck. And then, so you want to change the neck. It can be a simple change, like instead of a high crew neck, you want a low crew neck, or you want to do a drastic change, like from a crew neck to a V-neck. So you need to know, you need to measure your body and figure out how much of a change you want to make. So like in the example of the crew neck to V-neck, I would draw it out probably. I would measure my body. Where do I want that V-neck to end? And then I'm going to measure that to see how much space I've got from like the shoulder to that point. That tells me, and then I can multiply that by my 1-inch row gauge, and I know how many rows I'm working with in that area. And then I like to draw it out. Like I will take some graph paper and draw it out with the rows, and then I can work out the rates of either if I am working top down, I've got to increase stitches along each side to get to that shape. If I'm working from the bottom up, I'm going to be decreasing at that point. So you have to work out again that shaping rate, your decrease rate. So you need to know the stitches you're starting with and the stitches you're ending with. So how many stitches you're going to remove for that neckline or add in if you're working top down, but you have to know your starting place and your ending place, the stitches you have at the beginning and the stitches you need to have when you're done. Just like in the case of our sleeves and lengthening those or shortening those. You need to know those two things, the stitch count where you're starting with, the stitch count you need to end with, and how many stitches difference there is in between, either how many stitches you're adding or how many you are removing. In the case of the neckline, it's usually like one on each side, or you might be binding off a few all at once. You just need to know how that's going to work. That's why I like to draw it out. Like if I wanted to do, let's say, a scoop neck, then with that, if I look at it when it's drawn out, I know I'm going to be binding off like a few stitches all together right at the bottom of that scoop neck, and then decreasing some more at each side and then working straight. So the best way to see that is to actually draw it out like one square for every row in my pattern, so I can see where I'm going to be like removing all of those stitches, where I have to decrease a few, and then where I can work straight. Like this is definitely a step up, but once you've done like your sleeves or the body of your sweater and you've changed the shaping rate, it's not that much more difficult. You're using the same basic information, your starting stitch count, your ending stitch count, the number of rows you have in between to do that shaping. Same philosophy, just a different shape because you're doing the neckline. Now, sort of the next part of this would be adding short row shaping. That's another sort of intermediate thing to do. But if you're knitting a sweater in the round, either bottom up or top down, you have to add, well, you don't have to, but adding some short rows to the back neck to raise it is definitely something that you should have in your knitting toolbox. Like if you're knitting a sweater in pieces, you are working each piece separately, so you can make the back neck higher automatically anyway. Like if you pull out a t-shirt and lay it flat, you can probably see the back neck is up higher and the front neck comes down. That's done on purpose because our heads are not like sitting right on our neck, just flush and straight. It's sort of curved towards the front. Like, so we've got, if you measured from your back neck to your waist and then you measured from your front neck to your waist, you'd see there's a difference. You have more along the back than you do along the front because our head sits forward and we've got more space right there. So if you knit a sweater in the round from the top down or from the bottom up in the round around the neckline like a yoke sweater, you don't make any modifications. What happens is that neck of that sweater sort of pulls up, and you might start to feel like you're choking because it's pulling up to accommodate where it should be sitting on the back neck. So it pulls up this way and it gets too tight around the neck, so it can feel like it's fitting properly in the back. So you're constantly like pulling on your sweater to get it off your neck. That's why you would add some short rows just along the back, because you're adding a little bit of width or depth to that back area. Like you're adding a little wedge of fabric. There are two places you can do this. You can like cast on for your neckline, knit your neckline, and then stop and work that little wedge of fabric just along the back, maybe from the shoulders along the back neck. And that adds, you know, an inch or two. You don't have to do a ton. So you can do it there. Or like if you're doing like an all over color work pattern, there's a lot of color work going on in the yoke and you don't want to disrupt that, like it's going to make, you'll obviously see a big difference in the front and the back, then you can actually move that down, finish all that color work, and then work your short row shaping along the back before you divide for your sleeves and your body. You would stop and you would work your short row shaping there, because all you're really doing is adding some length to the back, and you can add that right up at the neck, or you can do it down below right before you divide for the arms and the body. You can add it there, and that will add some length to the back as well. So I put that in the intermediate category because, of course, you have to know how to work short rows, and if patterns don't have this, you have to know how to calculate it to work it out for yourself, which is also not hard to do. Generally, you just want like a couple inches, so you need to know your stitch and your row gauge, how many inches of short rows do you want to add in the back, and then use your stitch and your row gauge to figure out how. So like you would know how many inches you want, so you would multiply that by your row gauge. That's how many rows you're going to work flat to get that shaping. And then you'd have to figure that out, like how many stitches back and forth to do those short rows based on your stitch count. It's not hard to do. You can probably easily find this online to figure that out. I'm going to link to an article about the flax sweater specifically, where it talks about how short rows are added to that sweater, to give you an example of how this is done. But this falls into that intermediate category. Sometimes it's not included in a pattern, and this is something I would add if I were knitting a sweater in the round, like a top-down raglan or a yoke sweater, and it didn't include this shaping, then I would definitely add it. I don't like crew necks to begin with, and I would definitely want to not have it choking my neck. I would want it to be sitting properly in place, so adding more depth to the back so that sweater fits better. Okay, so intermediate number 2 would be changing the gauge of the pattern itself. And I do this quite often. Sometimes I knit my swatch, and I've done videos before where I show you. I have one, I'll link it down below, where I talk about, not this sweater, a different one that I knit this summer. My gauge was completely different. Actually, this was also one where I did that. My gauge was not matching at all. And I took my gauge and used that to figure out what size to knit. Now, to do this, you have to have knit a swatch and chosen the fabric you like, and a wide swatch, 6 to 8 inches. Like, don't knit tiny little swatch and try to get your gauge from that. The bigger it is, the better it'll compare to your actual knitting, using the yarn you're going to use and the actual needles you're planning to knit your garment with, and in the style that garment's going to be knit. If it's going to be knit in the round, your swatch in the round, you know, all of those basic things. I've got a video about that too, all of these rules for swatching. Not really rules, but guidelines to make your swatch tell you the truth. Because I know we always say our swatches lie, blah, blah, blah. Sometimes we're not helping it be truthful. There's things we can do to help it be as truthful as possible. Sometimes it's not going to be an exact science, because knitting a 6-inch swatch is not the same as knitting a full sweater. So things change. It's just, but the larger your swatch, the more likely you are to get closer to that number for your full garment itself. So anyway, you've swatched, you've gotten your measurements pre-blocking and post-blocking. That's a whole thing too. You want to see how that yarn is going to act when it's taken care of. And by blocking, I just mean washing and caring for that swatch like you're going to wash and care for your garment. You don't have to stretch it out and pin it out and do anything like that. Whatever you're going to do for the sweater, do that to your swatch, because that's going to tell you how that yarn is going to act in that final pattern or garment you're knitting. So you've swatched, you know your gauge. What I like to do is I measure my bust. I know what my upper bust is going to be, how much ease I want in that location. Usually not a lot, usually not more than 3 inches in the upper bust. And then I look for, so I add those two numbers together, my upper bust plus the amount of ease I want, add that up, and multiply it by my 1-inch stitch gauge, and that tells me how many stitches I want in the full circumference of my sweater. Then I have to go read through that pattern, and because it depends on if you're knitting a top down, you're not starting with your full circumference. If you're knitting from the bottom up, you might be, but there could be shaping involved. So you want to find out at that point of the full bust, really, in the pattern, look at the stitch counts in that location and find the one that is closest to your stitch count. And that's the size you're going to follow. I'm knitting a sweater right now, the Rose Cardigan by Andrew Mowry, using this principle, even though it's knit sideways. So I've had to rethink it, because I have to really understand my row gauge to get that circumference. But my gauge was completely different. And I'm a large person, but I'm actually knitting the small size, following those instructions, but still getting a pattern, a garment that will fit me, because my gauge was completely different. So this is definitely possible. Don't look at the sizes as, oh, why am I knitting a small when I'm usually an extra large? You're just using your gauge information. So you've got your gauge information, you know your measurements, multiply that so you know what stitch count you're looking for. So look for that pattern, for the area in the pattern where everything's joined in the round, or if it's knit flat, then you're going to divide that number in half, because you want just the half across, the full bust or whatever. Find that size in the pattern that's closest to that stitch count. That's the size you're going to follow. Now, that's sort of just the base guidelines for this. It can get a lot more involved, and you have to be willing to rip out and redo things. But once you have that, that gives you a base size to follow. But even looking at the schematic isn't going to be helpful for that size, because your gauge is different. So what I like to do at that point is, and this does take more time, is I take that schematic picture and that size, I highlight that size all through the pattern, and then I start to look for those numbers. Like it'll tell me, let's say it's top down, and I'm casting on along the back neck. How many stitches am I casting on? Like in another pattern that I did, the westbound, you're casting on from one, like the one sleeve to the other, that whole back width. So I looked at that cast on number and divided that by my 1-inch stitch gauge, and that told me how wide that was. So I could write that right on that schematic, that it was going to be this wide across the back. And then the same for like the armhole depth. How long, how many rows am I working in that armhole? It tells you usually how many inches you're working. Divide that or multiply that by my row gauge, and that tells me how many rows that I need to work. But then I can also take that, and then I can take that information, my row gauge, and put that in my schematic. Like I know these are the number of rows, so my armhole is going to be this deep. So you can figure all that stuff out from following that size in the pattern, but making changes. And then if you see something is not going to fit the way you want, you can change that too. From our other talk about customizations earlier, about the shortening and lengthening, changing the shaping. But this is sort of another intermediate thing. It's not that hard to do. Once you've done like all of some of these other modifications, using a different gauge for a knitting pattern isn't that hard. Depending, I mean, if you're making a ton of modifications, then you've got a lot to work out there. But if it's just that your gauge is off, and you might want to make a few things, shorten some sleeves, add some bust darts, it's really not that hard to do that, even with changing the gauge of the pattern, as long as you just know your stitch count, and then you find the size in the pattern that's closest to that stitch count, and then you can just follow that size for the pattern for the most part, and then add your modifications to it. We have 2 more to discuss, but before that I just want to mention again that if this is feeling overwhelming, get 1 or 2 of the resources that I mentioned at the beginning, because this is really spelled out very well in those books and in those resources and in those articles. And also if you want to just see my script to get a little more depth, or just to get some of this like written on paper so you can read it, then you can find that over on Patreon. All the patrons have access to not every single video script, but when I feel like there's a lot of information to share. So this one will be over there on Patreon. And you can always just do, there's a free 7-day trial of one of the tiers. You can just do that just to get the script and come say hey over there. But last 2 things. These are what I would call the most difficult. The first one is, let's say you find this wonderful pattern. It's a top-down raglan, but you just love the stitch patterns and some other elements in it, but you hate top-down raglans and you want to do a set and sleeve instead. That is like, you're just rewriting a pattern at that point. It's possible. You can do it. But that is a huge, huge change. And one I would not even, I can't imagine ever trying to do that. You can do it. I've never run across a pattern where I felt like I needed to make that much of a change to it. So I would put this in the very difficult category. And if you want to, you can. It's very hard. You're gonna want to get some of these resources we talked about and start reading up on sweater construction. An alternative is to really analyze what is it you love about that design, and can you, even if you have to purchase the pattern and never knit the sweater, but whatever that element is, take that, lift it out of that pattern, put it into another pattern that is the construction you want. Like say it's a top-down raglan, you want like a top-down set and sleeve. I would not try to convert that, but there are lots of top-down set and sleeves patterns, and if you have one you love, and you could take that element from that raglan pattern and plug it into this other pattern. That you could do. You could do the modification and change the sleeve construction, but that's like the hardest thing to do, is changing how a sweater fits in your shoulders and how that sleeve meets the body of the sweater. I mean, there's your set and sleeve, there's your drop shoulder, there's your raglan, there's your yoke. Those are your basic ways to knit a sweater. And changing from one to the other is the most difficult change. How that sleeve meets that body and how they're all worked together. That's the most difficult thing to change. That's why when we talk about choosing your base size, you choose a size based on that part, because then you don't have to make any changes. You can make your modifications everywhere else without having to touch that construction itself. So you can do it. I don't recommend it, but it's definitely something, I mean, if you feel the need to do, you could do. So the next one that is more difficult to do, but not impossible, I actually think it's easier than trying to change like the total sleeve and shoulder construction, is converting something from like from flat to in the round. Let's say you want a sweater, you love this sweater, but it's knit flat and you hate knitting flat and you want to knit it in the round. It's definitely possible. It's more difficult than some of the other things to do because you've got to figure out your stitch counts and how things are put together. As long as you have a solid understanding of how the sweater is constructed, or how it would be constructed if you decided to knit it in the round instead of following the instructions, it shouldn't be an issue. I would recommend Wendy Bernard's Custom Knits 2 has a really good section on converting patterns from like in the flat to in the round or bottom up to top down. I'm not sure what's included in there, but those kinds of things, they're definitely something you can do. It's just more difficult than a lot of the other modifications we've talked about. So that's why I have it listed as more challenging. This would be our difficult thing because you've really moved away from the pattern instructions. But as long as you know how the sweater construction should work, you should be fine. As long as you've done one before and you know that's the type of construction you like, you should be able to take the numbers from the flat pattern and then convert it to what you want. But there is guidance in Custom Knits 2 by Wendy Bernard if you want guidance for that. And I'm sure you'll find lots of resources online. It's hard to go into more detail now. We're already almost an hour here just going over the overview of how to do these things. But I'm sure in the future we can do some tutorials and really break these down specifically. But I just wanted to give you an idea of the types of modifications you can make and how easy or how difficult they are, and give you the resources to help you dive further into any of these. Perhaps in the future we can do some tutorials for each of them. But we'll be having that workshop. We'll be opening it in December. If you want to like walk through it step by step with me on how I would do it and how you can customize your sweater, starting with a top-down raglan, and then we'll probably do some other sweater constructions in future workshops. But you can join that waiting list. It'll be linked down below. But like I said at the beginning, this is only the part of getting a sweater that fits really well. The first step is choosing that base size, and sometimes you don't want to base it on your full bust. And we go really deep into that topic in our last Knit and Chat, so you can click right there on that video, and I will see you over there in that next video.